There were a couple of speakers that couldn't make it today, so they sent letters. I have 4. I'll just read one between each speaker or whatever till we get through them. This one from Sri Lanka. Anybody want to guess who it is? Arthur C. Clarke, right. From Arthur C. Clarke, Steve. I would like to send my best wishes to Stephen Jay Gould on the occasion of his Festschrift. Many years ago, we collaborated at long distance on a posthumous book by the most distinguished of American paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson. In parenthetical note, The Decolonization of Sam Magruder, St. Martin's Press, New York, 1997. Spoken like a true author, he puts the reference in his own letter. I regard Stephen as a national treasure and one of the few remaining bulwarks against the tide of superstitious lunacy which seems to be sweeping across the United States. Where are you now that we need you, Carl and Isaac? Back in 1987, Representative William Lehman from Florida read my essay, The Menace of Creationism, published in 1984, spring, Del Rey Books, 1984. No kidding. Into the congressional record on January 8, 1987. What congressman would have the guts to do this nowadays? Yet how else to prevent the corruption of children's minds in so-called schools that teach the insane idea that God has played a gigantic practical joke on the human race by creating the marvelously detailed geological record? All good wishes, Art Clarke. Yeah, he signs it Art. I thought we should start the formal presentations with a fellow tradesman. Steve has always called himself not a polymath, but a tradesman. His trade, his union card, is in paleontology and geology. Our resident paleontologist, geologist here from Occidental College, who Steve called the best proponent of punctuated equilibrium west of the Mississippi, or was it the Rockies? At any rate, it's out west. Dr. Prothero is a professor of paleontology and geology at Occidental College. He's a fellow of the Linnaean Society, a National Science Foundation fellow. He won the Schuchert Award, which is the paleontological award, also won by Steve, for the best paleontological work under age 40. Not the fossils, but the paleontologist. He's edited or co-edited and written numerous textbooks, technical monographs, and hundreds of papers in paleontology and geology. He is very well equipped to speak about Steve's work in paleontology and geology. Please help me welcome Dr. Don Prothero.
Thank you, Michael. It's always fun to be here. I spend a good deal of my time actually here at Caltech. I do all my lab work here because the machines are much better than at Occidental. So it's sort of interesting to find myself in this position as the sole paleontologist on this program about a paleontologist. And I thought about this and I realized I have to summarize about 35 years and about 400 and some papers in 30 minutes. A rather interesting challenge, but I hope I'll measure up to it. So hang on to your hats. This will go by pretty fast. But what I'd like to say is, as a paleontologist and the one speaking about paleontology at this meeting, he has probably more than any other person, except possibly George Gaylord Simpson, he's in the same league with him, influenced our profession in a way that no one else has. The profession has completely been transformed by Steve and by many of the people who work with Steve. And I feel very lucky to be of the generation that immediately followed him in his profession because, as I'll show you when we go through the slides, the whole profession was transformed by his peers in the late 60s, early 70s, the so-called Young Turks back then. And paleontology is a totally different world now, a very exciting world and a very dynamic world. And there's so many things that have changed and so many things that are new about it that I can only give sort of the highlights, some of the major themes that Steve has championed and introduced to the profession and are now sort of canonical that everyone in the profession constantly deals with. Before I get into that, though, let me just put a personal anecdote in here. I, too, am a product of the American Museum of Natural History and Columbia University. About 10 years after Steve left, I started my graduate career there. And even though Steve had been gone for more than 10 years, his legend was still very large among graduate students. I heard stories from one of the fellow graduate students, Jim Millett, who lived down the hall from him, about these incredible things Steve was doing in the 4 years he was at Columbia. He basically arrived at Columbia and 4 years later emerged with his PhD. And the apocryphal story is probably not true, but it grew over the years, was that apparently Steve was working happily away, publishing papers. He published his first papers 2 years after he arrived at graduate school, assuming he probably wrote them as he arrived. And he was already publishing 11 papers before he got his degree. But Jim told stories about how all the other grad students were intimidated by this Stephen Jay Gould in the hall there, and Stephen Jay Gould in his office writing away. And that's this legend I heard, at least, was that one day Norman Newell, his graduate advisor, said, well, Steve, you better get on your thesis at some point here and finish your degree. And then next week he came out with his thesis. So it's probably been a little bit exaggerated over time, but believe me, as a graduate student walking in his shoes some decade later, it was very intimidating to be in the halls that Stephen Jay Gould once walked. Anyway, his graduate career even, he was working on everything when he was in the early part of his career, everything from fin-backed reptiles like Dimetrodon to the mesonychids, which I'll show on the slides here, was one of these things that gave rise to whales, to mollusks, to theoretical topics. He was already a polymath in his very first papers, some of which were published, his two earliest papers were published in two of the most prestigious journals of the profession, American Naturalist and American Journal of Science. So it wasn't like they were backyard projects or anything like that. But more importantly, what I'll do when I talk about these themes that I'll show on the slides in a second here, I guess we can have the first slide now. Or should I just push my button? We'll see what happens here. Good. This is the cartoon Pat Lindsay did a few years back for a special issue that had Steve's work featured prominently. So Niles and Steve get their caricature here, a la Sgt. Pepper. The best way to measure a way someone has influenced a profession is to look at why the profession has transformed from his influence. And in this particular case, the way you can do this is by looking at the way paleontology textbooks and pedagogy have changed from the days before Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge and their generation to the way it is now. Certainly, when I was trained, I was lucky to be the first generation of students trained on the new generation of textbooks that Steve was influential in getting started. Raup and Stanley, very first edition, the very first year. I was one of the first students ever taught in that book. And prior to that time, paleontology was taught pretty much as sort of what was often referred to as stamp collecting. Tremendous amount of memorization of names of specimens and ages of specimens and their anatomy. Very little in the way of ideas. And you look at the textbooks prior to the mid-1960s or 70s, and you see there's a lot of material there, but not a lot of thought, not a lot of extension of those ideas into things like biology. And then Steve and Niles Eldredge and Steve Stanley and Dave Raup and a whole group of them who are all more or less contemporaries came along and they revolutionized their profession. They came along and changed the way we did things. In fact, two of them were involved and founded the journal Paleobiology, which is explicitly for theoretical papers, had no descriptive content in it whatsoever. And that whole generation then revitalized the profession, and now it's one of the most dynamic and exciting of all. And so I feel very fortunate. When I wrote a paleontology textbook a few years back, I was able to take that kind of revolution in the profession and integrate it into the textbook that we now use at this profession. And I'm proud to say that among the people in that textbook, the person who's most quoted is Stephen Jay Gould, along with Charles Darwin and George Gilbert Simpson. Very good company. So let me give you some quick, sort of a quick run through of some of these ideas and how the profession looks now in the post-Stephen Jay Gould era, in a sense. With some examples, okay? I just mentioned his graduate career here. This is photographed the way it appears in the book. Of course, I would turn the mesonychid up right side up if you wanted to see that. This is an animal that he worked on as a graduate student. I guess this was a class project under Malcolm McKenna, right, who was my graduate advisor. Malcolm gives you guys a class project to work on. It ends up being a publication in the American Museum of Natural History Bulletin sometimes. And these are the major areas I'll try to focus on today and just give you some highlights of it. I won't by any means try to give you the depth that it requires. But we don't have the time for that, unfortunately. I'm sure this is way too short a list, but I'm sure Steve will bear with me if I try to boil it down to 5 points in 30 minutes. Among the major themes, I'll talk about each of these. Growth and form, how shape changes with development, and size change especially between organisms. One of his favorite themes has been for many years, including the title of one of his books, Ontology and Phylogeny, the relationship between the development organism from embryo and adult, which is ontogeny, and their evolutionary history, which is phylogeny. I'll talk about that in a bit of detail. Functional morphology, how do things work? Okay, how do they put together? And are there constraints in how they're adapted? This is a place where he was a pioneer in introducing a lot of important ideas. And then this theme, which has been one of his favorite ones, are organisms necessarily as good as they can be, or they are just good enough to get by? This is a theme that has been very controversial even outside of paleontology, and I suspect some of our speakers today will talk about this as well. All sorts of themes are related to the idea of contingency, accidents and how they shape the history of life, the history of events that follow them, and how you could have a completely different story if you start with a different starting conditions. But by far his most influential area, where he's changed not just my profession, but much of biology as well, is the way in which he has changed the way everyone who deals with evolution has thought about evolution. And so I'll talk about that at greatest length at the end here. Okay, so we're talking about our first term. This is a topic that's in one of his very first papers, this idea of how shape changes occur when you get animals of a larger size or smaller size. This is a principle we know as allometry, a growth that's unequal. It's one, of course, that one of his personal heroes pioneered some many decades earlier, Darcy Thompson, in a famous book called On Growth and Form. This was a very interesting book, sort of a crossover between math and biology in a day when neither was very much talking to the other, and has all sorts of interesting ideas like the logarithmic spiral, for example, that you see in a nautiloid or here in an ammonite, about how mathematical principles control growth and form. And allometry in particular is an important concept because it's often the case in paleontology as well as biology that people look at two different organisms or two different specimens, they don't know which organism they belong to sometimes, and don't often assess the problems of how shape changes as things change in size. And just to give you a dramatic example of this, if you think about the proportions, here's a human baby scaled to the size of a human adult, so everything is scaled to uniform length here. And of course, as you know, a human baby has disproportionately large head and relatively short limbs, and then all those things change in proportion as you grow. Of course, your absolute size gets larger, but the proportions change dramatically. This is an allometric phenomenon, okay? You have a lot of examples of this. When you get larger, or when any organism gets larger, a lot of things have to change in the way of shape. This is a famous example out of Galileo that Steve recycled and I recycled, where, of course, you compare, say, the limb bones of smaller mammals with the limb bone of an elephant. Okay? They're not exactly the same in proportions. As you deal with an animal that gets huge in body size and weighs many tons, and its body size increases to the power of 3 because it's a cube of volume, it must have much stouter limbs than an animal of much smaller body size. And there are many, many applications of this all over biology and paleontology, a field that had not really been very prominent in paleontological literature until Steve started introducing some of it. And he took along a lot of ideas that had preceded him and developed them into a very interesting, robust field of ideas. This is out of one of Steve's actual papers here, a very famous example that had long been a classic case that was poorly understood, and he, in fact, the title of his essay, The Misunderstood, Misnamed Irish Elk, of course, is neither Irish nor an elk. It's a giant deer found all over the ice ages of Europe, not just Ireland. And for years, people had speculated as to what these gigantic antlers were doing on this thing. And these antlers weigh several hundred pounds, and they're a good 8 feet across in large animals. And yet they had to grow these things every year. This is a deer, right? It sheds this after mating season and grows another pair. And people had speculated, well, these things were maladaptive. These things were not suited for living. They grew out of control, and they had all these weird explanations for how they got to be this way. And Steve had a very elegant demonstration how they're really fundamentally just an allometric phenomenon, that this is a very big deer. Okay, it's bigger than a moose. And so it's going to have big antlers to begin with, and they're not that much out of line for the size of the deer that it is. Okay, moving right along here. I know I could talk about these topics, but we got to move along. An area that he spent a lot of time and written a lot of words about, the relationship between the development of organisms, not just their embryology, but also their adult development, and their evolutionary history. This is an area that had pretty much sort of gone into eclipse prior to Steve's 1977 book. And to a large degree, especially in biology, it had gone into eclipse because a century and a half earlier, von Baer, for example, had shown very clearly what the relationships were between embryology and evolution. Here's the title of his, or cover of his book. This is a modern diagram, not an ancient one, but the basic idea is, going way back to 1830s, von Baer had shown that there was very clearly a connection, that you could see some of the early evolutionary stages of many organisms. For example, in our evolution, we have a fish-like stage with gills and a tail and all sorts of things, which we gradually lose. And this was something known, and then by the 1880s, it in some ways was overextended and maybe over-corrupted by Ernst Haeckel, who got so enthusiastic about the idea that he started to do things with it that really weren't justified in terms of embryology. And then it got a bad reputation because of Haeckel's overextension of it. So by the time Steve's book came along, the words, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, one of Haeckel's famous slogans, were considered to be sort of an anathema. People didn't want to talk about it very much, and you didn't see it very much quoted or discussed in biological literature. Development had gone out of fashion, and embryology wasn't very popular back then. I took embryo about this time, and embryology was really in eclipse. And so this was something that Steve almost single-handedly revived into respectability. The first half of that book that I showed you in the previous slide is all historical. It talks about the concept from prior to von Baer all the way up to the present, and does a very good job of teasing out which ideas have survived over the last century and a half and which ideas were, like in Haeckel's case, a little overextended, which shows that we shouldn't have abandoned embryology so quickly. And then the second half of the book is one in which it really points out the importance of ontogeny and so on for evolution, not just in the traditional Haeckelian sense of trying to find the way Haeckel tried to read things is find our ancestors in our embryology, but pointing out how the many not really been appreciated of how we have an enormous evolutionary flexibility in our development. And he has many examples in this book. This is one that I love in particular, a particularly nice view of these guys. This is a salamander that's common in the lakes of Mexico, including the lake that used to be under Mexico City, called the axolotl in the Aztec language, or ambystoma in the scientific name for it. And it has a very interesting history. I'll repeat the figure that's on the cover of Steve's book there. This is an older illustration of it. Most salamanders, as you know, when they go through their development, eventually develop to adult salamanders have lungs. And they're primarily land-dwelling animals, although they stay close to water. And so their larval stage has the gills you see here. This group of salamanders, there's actually quite a few of them that do this, will hold on to their larval stage and become reproducing adults and never fully develop many times. Okay? And it gives them an evolutionary flexibility where they can stay much more aquatic without doing anything more than changing the timing of their development. And this is an important theme, that by just very small changes in what's already encoded in our embryology, you can make big evolutionary jumps. You can essentially retain an aquatic lifestyle and not become an adult that lives on land. And the thing about this is, if you cause lake conditions and these conditions to go bad, or you can do this in a laboratory where the lake conditions are intolerable, these things will finish their development and become lunged adults, and then they can go to another lake. So they have flexibility. They can stay in the water, or they become lunged salamanders and crawl out on land. Another example from Steve's book, this is a different kind of heterocony or evolutionary timing development problem, where aphids, for example, reproduce essentially asexually by cloning in essence, and do so very, very rapidly. And they do so when they want to exploit, let's say, a newly hatched or newly leafed out rose bush. So that's why you get an aphid infestation in a matter of days after they first appear. They can grow so fast and multiply so fast. And they do this essentially by reproducing as juveniles asexually. And they produce many, many juveniles, these ones right here, until such time as conditions get bad, like at the end of the fall, and then they go into sexual stage and they become winged adults, and they're able to lay eggs and survive till the next spring. Okay? And Steve introduced a very nice visual image to try to summarize this, where we compare timing, for example, of sexual development with timing of growth and attainment of body size, and talking about these two hands of size and hands of shape. This was a visual metaphor that helped quite a few people understand this process a lot better. You could look at each of these examples and modify this little clock model, as we called it, in order to understand this stuff better. Okay? And then this had, of course, striking interest outside of the traditional realm of biology and embryology and paleontology. In the latter part of this book, he brought up a famous idea from the 1920s. It was most famous by the work of Louis Bolk and the fetalization theory. He pointed out that a large part of what makes humans humans is also what we call neotenic. It's holding on to youthful features as a sexually reproducing adult. And the striking photographs he reproduced for this case, here's a baby chimpanzee and an adult chimpanzee. And if you compare the skull proportions of baby chimpanzee, it's very, very similar to what humans basically have. And the adult chimpanzee has, of course, gone in its own direction with its adult features that are very non-human-like. And from Bolk's time onward, there's a large amount of thought as to how much of what makes us human is really holding on to juvenile features of the ape, and neotenic apes. And in one of his essays, he quoted from the famous Aldous Huxley novel, one of my favorites as well, "After many a summer dies the swan," about the theme of immortality. And the mad scientist character in that novel, who's got a William Randolph Hearst type person bankrolling him, tries to essentially give this millionaire immortality by having him ingest carp guts. And at the end of the novel, of course, there's a murder, and they run off from California to go to England and trace down the third Earl of Gloucester, who was still siring children in his 100th year. They finally find the third Earl of Gloucester in the basement of his old ancestral mansion. He was 300-some years old, and he had become an ape. And then the examples extend also into other areas as well. He had an essay on Mickey Mouse. He's a very versatile guy. And he points out that in the subconscious of the Disney artist who drew Mickey Mouse from his Steamboat Willie days to his more modern incarnation, Mickey Mouse, if you remember him, Steamboat Willie, his first film, of course, was a sort of typical rat. He was very sadistic. He beat up on characters. He made sounds coming out of them because it was one of the first sound cartoons. And he's drawn in very rat-like proportions with relatively large ears and a long rat-like tail and a slender body. And then as Mickey Mouse became more and more innocuous and less the villain, but more like the straight man to all the other characters, he was drawn in a much more sort of childlike neotenic fashion. So he has a larger and larger head with larger eyes and relatively small ears and relatively small limbs. So it's something that's very much part of our subconscious coding. We recognize these juvenile features and we respond to them. And so when this character becomes more gentle and innocuous, he also becomes more neotenic. And this has influenced our profession in lots of ways. Many books have come out which have talked about this issue of developmental timing, we call it heterochrony in our language, and how it affects evolution. So there's been many books spawned out of both technical books and less than technical books. All right. Functional morphology, an area that a lot of people, both biologists and paleontologists, are interested in. Why do things work the way they do, and how do they work? And are there constraints on it, and are they as well designed as they could be? One of his most influential papers in this regard is one that's probably the second most quoted paper he's ever written. The first one's obviously the punctuated equilibrium paper. This one's probably the second most cited paper he ever wrote with Richard Lewontin at Harvard. And this was a paper which had pointed out that traditional neo-Darwinian adaptationist theory had gotten to the point where almost every time you read a paper like this, it was almost a just so story. People said, well, this thing is adapted for this purpose, and there was almost no real critique or testing of those ideas anymore. And so Steve came along, and Steve and Dick, I should say, came along and said, well, we got to recognize that not everything is adapted as perfectly we say, and we don't want to be like Dr. Pangloss in The Best of All Possible Worlds from Candide. We want to talk about things in terms of how they might function in a less than a perfectly adapted form. And his metaphor for this was the spandrels of San Marcos here, which are shown in the first illustration of this paper, where he pointed out that you could say, for example, that these illustrations here, which are, of course, this is San Marco Cathedral in Venice, by the way. These illustrations are very beautiful, and an adaptation might say, well, these spandrels here, these arches, are designed to put these illustrations on. And of course, that misses the point. The spandrels are there because they're an architectural foundation. They're part of building a structure like this, and the thing will fall if they don't have this kind of connection between the arches. And you have those things first as a functional necessity of a building block to build something like this, and then and only then do you have some place to put the ornamentation on. And so what he was saying in this metaphor is that the ornamentation is often mistaken for the essence, that the essence is the functional constraints. This is another paper on which he drove that point home very nicely in a normally not geological journal, the Journal of Daedalus, where he talks about constraints. Things don't always evolve in any direction without restrictions. Things have to be constrained by what they have in the way of building blocks to begin with. If you're built with a four-legged body plan, you're not going to have 6 legs, okay? And many more or less than trivial examples of how you can only go in certain directions when you start with certain possibilities. And then the other aspect of this functional discussion, just jumping ahead here, is that we often hear, especially when we talk to the intelligent design crowd among the creationists, how beautiful nature is and how wonderful nature is, how intelligently designed it is, okay? And one of Steve's major points that he's raised over and over again with multiple examples, which I'll show a few here, is that there are many places in nature where it's very poorly designed. It just barely gets along. It just barely survives. And it does not have to be perfect as long as the organism manages to survive and reproduce. And his most famous one, which was the title of one of his books, was the famous panda's thumb example, most of you are probably familiar with. Panda, like all other carnivorous mammals, is a normally 5-fingered paw that does not have an opposable thumb. If you look at your cat and dog, you know that. And yet a panda is probably the only carnivorous mammal that eats bamboo. It's sort of the only one reverting to a herbivorous lifestyle. And to do that, it has modified a wrist bone, the radial sesamoid, into a very crude, very jury-rigged type of thumb that it uses to strip the leaves off bamboo shoots when it eats. Not a good device, but it works just well enough so pandas survive. Of course, they're not surviving too well for other reasons, but that's another issue. This example, I think, was in the, the other one was in the video. This is a case of a fish that has a little lure on the tip of the spine, on the tip of its mouth, and it has this very sort of interesting little fan-shaped frill at the end of that spine that looks very poorly like a fish. If you don't have much, good sight, like most fish don't, it's good enough to lure you close, and then it swallows you up. Okay? Or this was the one in the video. Here's Lampsilus, the clam you heard mentioned in the video. This is its brood pouch, which sticks outside of its shell. And it has a little eye spot there and a little fringe that makes it look like a tail, and it entices another fish to come take a nip. And once that fish does, of course, the larvae come out of that brood pouch. They land on the gills of the fish that did that, and they're carried to the next generation. These things are not really good imitations of fish, but they're good enough to get by. Okay? Moving on, contingency. This is a topic I suspect we'll hear from other speakers as well, but I'll try to approach it from the paleontological perspective where it came from in his case. How do accidents shape the history of life? What kinds of things will we have if we reran the scenario back from the beginning and replayed the tape, as Steve puts it? This book in particular stimulated a tremendous amount of discussion, not just within my profession, but well outside of it as well, and it generated a whole bunch of interesting debate. And what it did, it was an interesting book, or sort of a classic Gould thing. He crosses over between society and science. Starts out with the Burgess Shale, a famous middle Cambrian deposit that's been known for over a century now, and has a spectacular fauna of really interesting animals that are known only because they're soft-bodied things that were preserved in this extraordinary case, although now we have several places like it that have similar animals. And so here is one of the older reconstructions of the Burgess Shale life with these strange beasts with 5 eyes and a nozzle on front. These things are called hallucigenia for obvious reasons, and unfortunately we now know these are reconstructed upside down. The spikes go up and these are feet that go down. This is how difficult it is to interpret these things, and many of these things may not be the jellyfish they are presented there. It's a more conventional view of them. And Steve went over the detailed work that Derek Briggs and Simon Conway Morris and Harry Whittington and others who had worked on these specimens for the last 20 or so years had done, and they had pointed out that a lot of the early work that was done on it, mostly by Charles Doolittle Walcott, one of the pioneers of paleontology, former president of the Smithsonian Institution, and so on. This is Walcott's idea of how, here's the Burgess Shale at this level here. You have this great diversity of bizarre things that aren't members of any living group, at least that we know of, although some of them are now being figured out. And Walcott tried to shoehorn them all into major living groups as best he could. He didn't want to have any more diversity in this fauna than he could help. And he projected this backward in time like it was all one gradual transformation. So this thing sort of predicted that before the Cambrian there was all these things that we don't have record of. And Steve pointed out the recent work that was done by Whittington and Briggs and Simon Conway Morris has shown, yes, many of them are in distinct groups. Also, others are in groups that we now know are living today. But what it says is the Burgess Shale is at a time when there was a huge diversity of body forms we just simply don't have on this planet anymore. They would be different phyla if they were placed in a taxonomic rank. And some of them are still put in different phyla. And yet, since that time, of course, this has been pruned down, so only a handful of lineages are still found today, very successful groups that dominate the world's oceans today. And what Steve points out in this essay, and then this whole book goes on this theme, is that you could never predict, standing back there in the Middle Cambrian, that this would end up like this. You could never predict that we wouldn't have a world populated by descendants of hallucigenia. Okay? Instead, we have a world populated by descendants of this little animal, Pichea, which is also from the Burgess Shale. And Pichea is a little tiny fossil of a thing we have living today, the lancelet or Amphioxus. It's one of the earliest non-vertebrate relatives of the vertebrates and one of the earliest fossils we know that's related to us. And this thing is not even a very common thing in the Burgess Shale. It's a fairly rare thing, and you would never guess, if you were standing back in the Cambrian, that this would be us today talking about this topic. Okay? And so Steve's point is the little accidents of history can make a big difference. If this thing had not survived, we wouldn't be doing this right now, okay? And maybe hallucigenia will be up here on the podium instead, all right? Interesting concept. Anyway, so the point being then is that you can't predict these things. Life is not predictable. Evolution is not predictable. These things are very much accidents of history. And of course, the title of his book was a deliberate play on the title It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart, directed by Frank Capra. And as you know, the main point of that movie was the idea that if he had not done what he did, if he had not saved his brother and lived as he lived, of course, the world would have been different. It would all have been Pottersville. As most of you remember that movie. And a very different world would have resulted if he had not been born. Well, a very different world would have resulted if this thing had not survived. And we can't predict these things. Life isn't as progressive as we like to think it is. The end results are very much affected by early chance events that may or may not be the kinds of things we think of. All right, with my final few minutes here, let me jump into the area where he's had by far the greatest influence in both my profession, especially in biology. I vividly remember the 1980 Chicago Macroevolution Conference where this topic got to be very controversial and people were standing and shouting at each other, a lot of heat and generated in the process. In a nutshell, what Steve has done and his colleagues in paleontology have done, and I take myself to be one of those colleagues who followed along in this tracks, we have changed the way everybody, biologists, paleontologists, and all the rest, look at evolution. And it's not as simple a story, not as straightforward a story as we once thought. And those of you who were here at last year's symposium might have heard me talk about this in greater detail. Lots of new ideas are going on in evolution. At one time, and especially in 1959, the centennial of Darwin's book, it was a big unanimous, neo-Darwinian synthesis, and it was fairly unanimous, which is usually a bad thing in science. When everybody's agreeing and no one's arguing anymore, the science gets stale. Okay? The good sign is when science is debating things and when there are new ideas that are being pushed around. And Steve and Niles especially were very responsible for making evolutionists and traditional biologists look at evolution a different way and ask questions in a way that had not been asked before. Let me show you how that works. It's a complicated theme. We have to go through it. First of all, he's been one of the champions for some of the, shall we say, slighted and neglected members of the evolutionary community. This man in particular, Richard Goldschmidt, was pretty much given short shrift during his lifetime. And yet he had ideas, as you can see, Steve was the one who got this book republished and introduced it himself. He had ideas that were very progressive for his time. I mean, you would read his words and you would hear homeotic genes and all these other new ideas about large-scale changes that were not predicted in Goldschmidt's time, except by Goldschmidt. He, of course, couldn't know everything, but he was remarkably ahead of his time, and Steve has brought that point out. But this is the area where Steve's greatest influence is. Here's the way things were prior to 1972 in that paper we've just talked about. The way that most people in the paleontology community certainly looked at the fossil record was inherited from Darwin, this idea that everything should evolve gradually. And this is partly because Darwin himself was a product of Victorian times and very much in the mode of thought that everything had to have a gradual transformation. They abhorred the idea of revolution. After all, the French had just been through one, and there was revolutionary fever running through all of Europe at that time, and even in the 1850s they were still worried about it. So he was very much a product of conservative Victorian society and this idea of gradual change, in his own words, in sensibly graded sequences. And then for a century after Darwin, paleontologists basically tried to follow this lead. They tried to find gradual sequences in the fossil record. So that was the kind of thing we're looking for. If you have a fossil at this time level here, and this is, I say, frequency distribution of around a mean of all the features of this fossil, it would gradually, the time this frequency distribution would shift and eventually lead to a new lineage. And that's phyletic gradualism. That was still prevalent in the books prior to the 1970s. And you see that people, for example, were trying desperately to make this work. And so you look at Simpson's classic work in 1944, where he pretty much said that all of paleontology consisted with the neo-Darwinian synthesis that was then emerging. And paleontologists trying over and over again, and sometimes special pleading and bending the examples all out of shape to find gradual changes in the fossil record. And the whole irony of this was that it was all unnecessary. Because by 1942, and certainly by the 1950s, people like Ernst Mayr and other pioneers in biology were saying that the allopatric speciation model made a completely different prediction of how species should appear than when you thought at one time. Okay, this is an example of Simpson trying to make horses gradually transform from one-toed to three-toed, or three-toed to one-toed, and so on. The allopatric speciation model that Mayr introduced in the 40s and 50s points out that when you look at large populations, which is mostly what we're seeing when we see your average fossil samples from the mainland population, a large group of people, or animals, which interbreed, they have high gene flow, and they're homogenized. They resist change because there's so much gene flow among individual population. Yet, when you take about populations that are out on the periphery, they might be isolated in a corner of the range or maybe on an island or something like that, those are going to be, first of all, especially if they're an island, they're going to be a very small number of individuals. The population that founded that island population will have an unusual gene frequency just by a random sampling chance. And that unusual gene frequency, if they stay interbreeding with each other and restricted to their narrow range to begin with, will be inbred into everything that's descended from them, so that sooner or later that population will have a gene frequency that's different from the mainland. And then these unusual genes become eventually, they become sympatric. They live in the same area with their ancestors. Allopatric means a different homeland. Sympatric means living in the same place. When they repopulate the ancestral population, they're already different enough that they no longer interbreed, and at that point they're a new species. Okay? And this is the diagram from Mayer's work showing this idea of one main population splitting into little peripheral isolates, and here's one that's split off. A barrier develops in these things as the shade of the gray changes, they become more different. So here, for example, one's reintroduced, they're now overlapping again, but they're not the same species. Now, what does that do? That predicts that speciation, the way biologists have been seeing it since the 1950s certainly, should be a geologically rapid phenomenon, right? It takes place in a few tens or hundreds of generations, which for a geologist is instantaneous. We can't see hundreds of generations in any organism, okay? We're looking at every bedding plane as maybe several 100,000 years apart. All right, we're not used to seeing things at that fine scale. So at a geologic scale, that should be instantaneous. We won't be able to see an event that's fast. Okay. Also, it's very likely it won't occur in the area we're looking at. It'll occur somewhere we don't have a sample. All right. So the result then is new species will appear suddenly in the fossil record without apparent ancestors, at least the place we're looking. And that once a species is established, this was the other major thing, it should be showing no further change. It will be what we call static, or it has stasis, okay, which is the Greek for standing in one place. All right. And that was the essence of the punctuated equilibrium model, that you have long periods of stability in species. You may have a little bit of fluctuation around the mean, but no net change in any one particular direction. And then every once in a while you have a branching event, an allopatric speciation event, and you get a new species, okay? And that may be so fast that you can't even see it in the geologic record, but then lo and behold, you have two species side by side. Okay, and there have been many examples documented of this since, and this was a cartoon version of Peter Williamson's work on lake snails from Lake Victoria. And just to make a long story short here, in the now 20-some years since this paper came out, 28-some years since this paper came out, the overwhelming consensus, I think that's in my next slide here, yeah, in most animals, the overwhelming prevalence is stasis and punctuation, with almost no exceptions among metazoans. The place where you see the exceptions are in asexual cloning things like planktonic microfossils, which I personally have worked on. There is a fair amount of gradualism here. I saw this, and Steve was kind enough to visit me in the lab at Lamont when I was a graduate student and see this himself. But the problem is, of course, you can't apply allopatric speciation to that because these are asexual. Okay? You don't work with things that are asexual. I'm talking about a model that's based on sexual organisms. Okay? But more importantly, whether or not you take this part as seriously as some people do, this is one that has emerged, and basically it was a dirty little trade secret in paleontology for a long time. Paleontologists are desperately trying to find gradualism in the fossil record and having a very hard time of it. And they swept that fact under the rug for most of several generations. And yet they're happily doing biostratigraphy, using fossils to date rocks, because fossils are very static through time and they're very distinctive, and you can tell what time it is if you have the right fossils, which tells us that they are static, that they are stable over long periods of time, something we basically knew but we didn't really address until this whole way of thinking came along. Now, what this implies, when you talk about stasis over hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, or excuse me, millions of years, tens of millions of years, you're talking about a scale, again, that's beyond the realm of biology as we now know it. Okay? It's a scale very much larger. It implies a stability that is way in excess of anything you can do with a laboratory with fruit flies or lab rats. Okay? And that it suggests that species are stable over a long period of time, in spite of the fact that we know over periods of that kind of time there's got to be selection to change them. And I'll show you examples of that in a moment. Okay? So for our metaphor then, this was the traditional neo-Darwinian metaphor, and we're just about into round ball season, so this is appropriate. The traditional neo-Darwinian metaphor for species was that they're infinitely flexible. They could roll in all directions like a ball on a landscape. In fact, adaptive landscape is a common visual metaphor for this process. And what Gould and others have pointed out, that maybe species are not, in fact, able to go in all directions equally well at all times, that they have stable states, like these faces on polyhedra, and then they flop over to another stable state, and then in between there's rapid transitions and then stability again. Okay, they exceed a threshold, and then they're under a stable state. Here's another version of this. You have a rolling cylinder versus a rolling hexagon. The idea, again, that this one goes in rapid change and then stability versus this thing is continuous. All right. Put in a plug for my own work here. The work I've done in the mammals from North America, especially from the Eocene here when things were jungles, even in Wyoming and Montana, to the Oligocene where things were much drier, area where I've done a lot of work because I've done the dating of the beds as well as worked on most of the mammals, and one of Steve's former students, Tim Heaton, and I worked on this together. And the general point that we came up with in a series of papers we published in the last few years is that there is a well-documented climatic event right here at this time interval right here. All the change that occurs is actually out of sync with it. It's earlier and it's very minor, and most things do not change at all through that lineage. So we have a very dramatic case, and I've got other examples I published as well, but I don't have time to talk about, where we can see dramatic evidence of climate change, and in this case, the mammals don't give a damn. They just go right on through. And that certainly is contrary to what a lot of us have been taught, certainly what I have been taught as an undergraduate. That, you know, you take the classic example of Galapagos finches, and they modify their beaks every year thanks to the changes in rainfall. Well, on this scale, they don't show change at all. They just pay no attention to climate change. All right, so the implications then. Extreme stability over millions of years and strong selection by climate cannot be explained by the traditional neo-Darwinian methods that are out there right now, stabilizing selection being the one that's most commonly put out. That also implies that species are real entities. They have an existence unto themselves. They're not just an arbitrary collection of populations that people happen to see. I mean, species recognize each other. They know who to breed with and who not to breed with. And then we should realize that they have a reality. They're an entity unto themselves. And that species will have a birth, which is speciation, and a death, which is extinction. Okay? It's a process, it's a hierarchical level above the process that operates at populations. And so that's what it's saying down here. These processes operate at level of species may be different for those which operate on individuals and populations. So here's a stabilizing selection example from neo-Darwinism where you have a mean that's pushed in one direction or another by various factors, and that really isn't apropos for something operating on these scales. And so what's happened now is people have begun to realize this is a hierarchical process, the things that happen to species, which is really what we care about in the long run. It's nice to know what fruit flies do over the short run, but really what we care about in the long run is what happens to species over millions and tens of millions of years. That's my domain. That's paleontology, okay? And what we're saying is species are these hierarchical level above the genes, the individuals, and the populations. They have properties unto themselves. They don't necessarily reflect the properties of the component populations of which they're made of. And the different processes may affect the success of species. And this is called now, it used to be called species selection, but that got confusing. We now call it species sorting. And those processes may not be the same that affect the individual populations and make it up. So here's a sort of simple little comparison here. At the individual level, we talk about a process, natural selection, which selects for individuals and causes change. And each individual is born and dies. And then at another hierarchical level up here, the species, the process that affects here is not natural selection, but species sorting. And that it causes speciation to occur, and then it causes extinction to occur. All right? Some examples. Famous work by Elizabeth Verber, now at Yale University. She did this when she was in South Africa. She studies the evolution of antelopes from southern parts of Africa that have evolved throughout the last 7-8 million years especially. And there are two major groups. So this is one group here, the wildebeest and the hartebeest and their relatives, and the other one is the impalas, which I don't have a picture of here. And they have totally different evolutionary histories. She showed this here for the example. The impalas, which are this sort of one lineage over here with one species at a time, are very low in diversity. And it's partly because of the way they live. They have a very limited ecology where they basically stay in the same kind of bushes, and they're not diversified in any other kind of ecology. So they have a very restricted ecology, and they're very low in speciation, whereas the wildebeest and hartebeest and gnus and all their relatives are tremendously speciose, both in the past and the present. And so we have one group here which has a high speciation rate, and another which has a low speciation rate. Very different phenomena that's rooted in their ecology. So these are examples of species sorting, the impalas versus gnus I just talked about here. Torhans and others talked about marine snails that have planktonic larvae will speciate more rapidly than those that do not have planktonic larvae, those that do. If they have planktonic larvae, they can get all over the world, in a matter of a few weeks when they spread out across the world's oceans, so they don't have any way to be isolated very much. But those that don't have planktonic larvae are restricted to small areas, and they have a much higher chance of speciation. This is another interesting example that Norm Galinsky brought in. That was an example of two rodents from South America, the tuco-tucos versus the coruros. The tuco-tucos, let me show you these, are these little guys right here, genus Tenemes. They're related to the guinea pig and the capybara and the agouti, other South American cavomorph rodents. They have a very, I think it's a low rate of speciation because they are very large colonies. I can't remember the details now, but very large colonies, a lot of interbreeding, so they don't get around very much, or they don't, they breed so much that they don't basically get a chance to speciate very much. Their close relatives, the coruros, have very small populations and restricted colonies, and they don't interbreed with other colonies very readily, and so they speciate at a much higher rate. Okay, and there are more examples of that, but I won't belabor it because I'm just now at my limit. And this paper, Steve published now 20 years ago, it's hard to believe that, says it all, is a new and general theory of evolution emerging. And of course, I hope this next book that he's supposed to be publishing soon will tell us what he thinks in terms of the new and general evolutionary theory. But the point is, he's revolutionized the way all of us, paleontologists especially, but even most biologists now look at evolution. We hadn't got as well explained as we thought we did about 30 years ago. And that's good, okay? We have lots of new things to discover. We're not just statically standing around like we were in 1959 with all the answers. We have new questions. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
When Carl Sagan died in 1996, within 2 years there were 2 biographies out about Carl and his life. And so I read both of them and reviewed them. And when I was reading the books, I was struck by the kinds of generalizations that the authors would make about Carl's personality and his social attitudes and so on. For example, they said, well, he was a liberal on paper only, that he was an Adlai Stevenson kind of liberal, after-dinner cocktail party liberalism, but not the kind of in-the-street activism where you're actually out there protesting or you're writing actively about this on a regular basis. So I thought, I wonder if there's some way to test that. I mean, can we actually have some measure of what Carl actually really did? Well, it turns out, thankfully for future biographers, is that Carl kept detailed records of everything he did in his curriculum vitae. He has the biggest curriculum vitae I've ever seen. It's 264 single-space type pages, the big, huge volume, 3-ring binder, which his wife Anne was kind enough to send me. So that got me thinking about quantitative biography. In history, they call this cliometrics. Clio, the muse of history, and turn it into a metrics. Maybe there's sort of a biometrics. Is there some way we can kind of count what people do to try to get our minds around answering some questions about generalizations of them? For example, so we're going to start here today with the light, fluffy stuff and then move to the deeper stuff. What I wanted to get actually was average data from the entire National Academy of Science, which I was unable to get. They told me they don't really keep this kind of data, even publication records. So what I ended up doing to make the comparison for Carl was a cohort of his, what I consider to be his colleagues, which included Jared Diamond, Ernst Mayr, Ed Wilson, and Steve Gould. And so I got all of their CVs and laid them out there, and since I couldn't get the average for the National Academy of Science, I figured, well, I'll get some of the most stellar members and then compare them. So I start off with that, and And as you can see, the stair-step march there. Now, this doesn't tell us a heck of a lot, although when I was telling Ernst about this, Ernst is he's a very quiet, modest man on the surface, but he has a lot of testosterone, Carol. He's a competitive fellow, so when I was getting the count there, he said, well, what did the other guys have? Because, and I didn't mean to do this as a vertical slide, Carol, with those. It just worked out that way. Who's got the biggest? Well, in any case, so I said, well, Steve's got 44 and Wilson 26. Oh, but mine are from the very best universities, from Bologna. And see, it's not size, it's what you, yeah, okay, right. Diamond, by the way, doesn't like going to give the lectures for the honorary degree, so he just turns them down, he tells me. I did some comparisons of Carl's books, and so of course we can flip this around. This was from a year ago, and then I added and updated this particular slide, so Steve is now tied with Ernst Mayr at 22 books. You have to break it down. Again, this doesn't tell us a lot, but you have to break it down into edited, co-edited, co-authored versus solo. So Steve's number one at solo-authored books, Carl at 12, and Ernst at 13, and Ernst couldn't exactly say, well, mine are from the very best publisher, because they're all from good publishers. Then I started taking a look at the overall corpus of Steve's work and again, make some more comparisons. First of all, you start off with, might loosely call a taxonomy of somebody's works. What are they interested in? I was interested in what Carl's diversity. I was interested in Steve's diversity. By the way, in Sagan's CV, you can actually count the number of op-ed pieces he wrote that were related to social activist-type subjects, nuclear weapons and women's rights, things like that. He was most definitely not just an Adlai Stevenson after-dinner liberal. He was in the streets sort of liberal. And so anyway, you start off by doing these sort of taxonomies. I included in here the 9 different collections of natural history volumes, plus the 2 photograph books that you have. And then just sort of looked at it this way. The Mismeasure of Man is in here. His next coming book on evolutionary theory is included in that. Some of this data, by the way, is in that program that I put together. I should point out, I'm sort of out to an even 300, but it's 300 essays, not 300 months. There's some 2-parters in there, so don't go, that's not a reliable source. There's some errors in there. But it still came out anyway because I mixed up the numbers and duplicated the numbers in the 1 through 300 listing. And it's really odd that it came out still at 300, and had it not, I would have caught it. But anyway, so I don't know if it's psychics or gremlins or what that made that happen. So if you look at career publications, now here we have to be careful what you're looking at in the CVs. Carl's CV included everything he ever did, including any interview he gave. So I had to weed that out. He did have a primary, secondary, tertiary list, so I just left out the tertiary and included at that, and you end up with 779. For Steve, this includes the 300 monthly essays. And again, Ernst pointed out, well, mine are in Nature and Science. Well, all these guys have tons of publications in Nature and Science, so we can't just look at that. Of course, Carl has stopped publishing. Steve, here we are paying this tribute. He did this, he did that. Well, he's still going to keep writing, of course, so this will continue going up. I think even more striking is to look at the monthly output. It's hard to write good, serious works that have research involved in them. It's hard to crank them out. I was impressed when I was reading the Sagan biographies, as were his biographers, that despite all of his popularization. Okay, here was another question I was trying to answer with Carl. The critiques of Carl that he was a mere popularizer. Now, Steve doesn't get that on the same level Carl did, but you can actually ask, okay, is that all he's doing, is popularizing? Because you can look and see what the publication record is. So these are, Carl was cranking out a peer-reviewed scientific journal publication every month, in addition to all the popular stuff, and Steve tops them all out at 22.3. Again, this is counting the 300 essays, which I count because they're serious works. They're not just op-ed type pieces. Then I took the whole let's see, the whole literary corpus, all books, papers, articles, essays, and reviews, total publications of 902, 25.8 per year over the whole. And then I just sort of grouped them by this way so you can see what he's doing: book reviews, essays, books, and scholarly scientific papers. And then, just for fun, so we have a little bit of fun here, I categorized all the book reviews, mostly New York Review of Books and New York Times, but some other places, by subject. What is he interested in writing about? Turns out, because you never know until you actually count them up, history of science. This is by number of reviews. History of science is his favorite subject, that is, his favorite books to read, to write reviews about. Second, evolutionary theory. Third, what I call science studies, which I break out from history of science here. Fourth, baseball. And then race and IQ and paleontology, geology, and so on. But just for grins, because I was noticing, Steve, when I was going through your CV, that there was ganged reviews, that the reviews would often have multiple books. So it turns out history of science is not his favorite subject to review in the New York Review and New York Times. It turns out it's baseball. At 35 books officially reviewed, and then history of science and then evolutionary theory. So those are tied there. 140 books read for review. If we take just the scientific papers, removing the books, the book reviews, and so on, and just look at the different subjects, evolutionary theory by far and away dominates. Now these are the scientific papers. I think this was not counting the 300 essays. So these are just the peer-reviewed scientific papers. History of science, natural history. Interdisciplinary included a lot of fascinating papers on choral music and architecture and so on. We were driving up the 110 freeway through Old Town Pasadena, southern Pasadena, and there's those Victorian houses on the right. Have you seen this? The old Victorian houses on the right when you're coming up from LA up the 110. So he noticed this, and I thought, well, I should say something and pretend like I know what I'm talking about since I live here. So I said, oh yeah, those were probably built in 1910. And he says, no, they were built in 1880s. Okay. So, and then, by the way, Steve, I found out this morning when I was telling somebody this story, those houses weren't there at all. They were moved there from downtown LA, and now it's a museum, which I didn't know, so now I have to go. Then if we take, okay, that's too many subjects. That's too much data to get our mind around. So if you condense it down to just 5 subjects. So Don Prothero, we're going to have to kind of meet and talk about this as independent raters here. So I got evolutionary theory, paleontology, which I include paleobiology, paleoanthropology, geology, punctuate equilibrium, history of science, interdisciplinary, including baseball. And by the way, a lot of these baseball articles, again, are not just fluff pieces about how baseball resembles the economy of the United States or anything like that. These are actually like statistics and data and graphs and charts, and required some research. And baseball people collect that kind of data like nobody else. And then I looked at the 5 literary corpus specialists. Just take the whole group. Now this number is way too high because when you take the 300 essays, the essays are long and complicated enough that they can have multiple categories. In fact, they do. They have at least 3, most of them have at least 3 different things going on, which I'll show you in a minute. So again, what is he doing more than anything else? He's an evolutionary theorist, of course, but history of science and science studies is always deeply embedded and very close, even if you count them up that way for the whole corpus. And then, of course, he does some social commentary and interdisciplinary work. So now if we just look at the essays themselves, the 300, I thought it'd be fun to look at length. He wrote an essay on the creeping fox terrier. This is the creeping Gould terrier as he got longer and longer. And either reached his sort of normal length where he feels comfortable, or the magazine just reached their level of tolerance. Richard Milner's can explain that. So I think this was probably the dip here, Steve, with the bout with cancer here, and so then recovered from that. And actually a little slide down there, so it is good you're retiring. You know, the batting average is dropping, time to get out. But really, I think these are too short to have the complex interplay of 3 different things, which we'll see in these different themata that come up. This is about the right length to have a complex enough essay to say something significant with some research in it, but not so long that you burden the reader and they just can't hang in there long enough in our soundbite culture. I thought it'd be fun to look what's his favorite century. Well, I guessed that, and that was correct. The 19th century is where he spends the most time. 220, not all essays are historical, but if you think about it, 220 of the 300 have a major historical component to them. He really is interested in history and history of science, where he spends the most time. Somebody complained, one of his critics complained that he uses too many foreign phrases, so I thought, well, we can quantify this. How many foreign phrases does he use? So I counted them up. This eye-blurring experience, believe me, because I started way too late to get this ready. I didn't know how long it was going to take. So anyway, 6. Now I didn't count everything. You can't natura non facit saltum. You can't count that because he's not throwing that in for literary flair. That's an actual phrase that Darwin used and he discusses it. So I didn't count any of those. These are phrases thrown in just for fun, for a little flair, for a little challenge. Some of his critics complained about this. I think this is wrong in the sense that the purpose of reading good writing is to challenge yourself, is to improve, is to get better. It's no fun to play somebody in sports that's worse than you. Well, I mean, it's fun for a little while. but you're not going to get any better, right? The only way to get better is to push yourself. If you got to go to the dictionary once in a while, that's all right. Your vocabulary improves, and I did a few times, more than a few times. Okay, as for literary references, it seems like Gilbert and Sullivan comes up a lot, and they do. But the Bible is by far and away number one at 53 official references, not counting 4 full essays that were complete biblical exegesis, discussion of biblical texts, all related somehow to science, but setting those 4 aside, all within the last 2 years, by the way, you still get that. Actually, Gilbert and Sullivan were even ahead of the Bible in the early years, and then the Bible caught up in about the last 5 years or so. And then they almost got caught by Shakespeare. He was coming in strong at the end, so again, maybe it's good you retired. And then Alexander Pope, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and this doesn't count the full essay you did with all the quotes. And then Goethe, again, not counting the full essay on Goethe, and Milton and Wordsworth, and then there were a few other poets that made their way into the essays: Matthew Arnold, William Blake, Robert Burns, Chaucer, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Dryden, T.S. Eliot, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Robert Frost, Omar Khayyam, Rudyard Kipling, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Robert Louis Stevenson, Jonathan Swift, and Walt Whitman. Well, yeah, but that's popular culture. I'm getting to that. That's a different category, you see. This is, and so here you go. These are sort of pop references, and I'm sorry, Steve, but after about 150 essays, I quit doing this because I ran out of time. It was taking too long to write them all down. But these are within the first 150 essays, references to 2001 and 1984, the Treaty of Ghent, Don Quixote, Pinocchio, and here's the one reference Prothero made, After Many a Summer Dies This One. My favorite, of course, is Alice in Wonderland, and Flesh Gordon, right? So, I mean... It's true he's a Harvard intellectual, but he doesn't mind dipping down once in a while there. The Incredible Shrinking Man. Again, just having a little bit of fun here. This quote appears 7 times in the 300 essays. I don't know if you even knew how many times it came up. It is one of the great quotes from Western culture, from Karl Marx's 1852 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historical facts and personages occur, as it were, twice. He's forgotten to add the first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. I got it from you. I then used it in a creationist op-ed piece I just wrote, in which I said the Scopes trial and those guys were the tragedy, and the new intelligent design creationists are the farce. And they didn't think that was very funny. But this quote from the same document. The 18th Brumaire appears 4 times, and it's again another of these great quotes that plays on that themata of time zero, time cycle. Men make their own history, but not just as they please. There is that interplay between free will and determinism, what we can do, what we can't do. We'll see that come up over and over. So then you start putting these into primary essay subjects. That is, I first started to look at the whole essay. Just take a single essay, 5,000 words or whatever, and then say, what is this essay most about? And then you tick that off, and I had a little coding system for myself. And so history of science and science studies. These are so interrelated, I really couldn't separate them because when you're doing history of science, most of the time you have some commentary about how science used to work or how it should work or whatever. And so that came up the most. Then evolutionary theory by barely half of that, natural history, paleontology, geology, and social science, social commentary. But, and by the way, on the history of science stuff, these were all of the essays that were actually, the dominant theme of the essay was a single individual. So does Steve Gould do history of science? Yeah, boy, does he ever in a big way. These are not just references to these people. These are a considerable discussion. Now, obviously, it's not a full biography in a 5,000-word essay, but that's a lot of people. I mean, if you were to take any professional historian of science, and if they did even a quarter of this many people in their career, they would have had a very successful career. So he does a lot of history of science. But now if we take and look at the big picture, that is primary, secondary, tertiary, and by the way, here's another one of these bizarre typos. If you read it quick, primary, secondary, tertiary, you missed that I left the D out. And I did this throughout that whole program. It's the strangest cognitive thing. Maybe it's a guy thing. I don't know. And so you get... so again, if you just compare the primary category of history of science, science studies, then this wins out over evolutionary theory. But the history of science is actually being used for a reason, a deeper reason. And when you look at the secondary and tertiary levels, primarily, but let's look at the secondary. Here now evolutionary theory comes in very dominant over history of science. So history of science comes in first, it's dominant, but it's there for a reason, a deeper reason, a more important reason. So if we reduce that down, that is, you add them all up, primary, secondary, tertiary, and you get then total essay subjects by adding them up. So then you get evolutionary theory then becomes dominant over history of science, natural history, paleontology, and so on. So now, so far all I'm doing is taxonomy. It's almost like stamp collecting. Is there something deeper we can say about this, about how a person thinks and writes? What's going on deeper inside their brain? Frank Sulloway, who's going to speak after me, after lunch, and this is sort of a 1-2 lecture. They really go together. Wrote a review for the New York Review of Books on this book. And he ganged up the rest of Gould's books that he'd written before this one and played with some ideas of themata, that is, deeper themes that come up over and over throughout essays and books and so on, that are the substrate beneath the specific subjects that's being discussed. There's something deeper going on in those books and essays. And this is one of the themes, this times arrow, time cycle. It's one of Steve's favorite themes. It's an important theme in all of I wouldn't even say all of evolutionary biology, all of science. It's asking this question about the linear nature of contingent history that doesn't repeat itself versus these sort of deterministic laws, the cycles of a planetary revolution versus the contingent history of the evolution of a species, which is what's in that final quote in Darwin's book, which is why Steve quotes it so many times. It appears 7.3 times, by the way. I couldn't count it full because you only used part of the quote several times, so I had to add up the actual number of words. It's the full quote without by the creator. We leave that out. It's 56 words long. Anyway, so then you take so here's the themata I came up with. Part of the problem here is there's so much data that it requires really some quiet reflective time for a while to sort of sort through it all. So this is an experiment in progress. But when Frank and I were talking through all these things, where would you put this essay, where would you put that, and so on, these are the 5 we came up with. Theory and data, which is this the stuff Carol was talking about, the interaction between theories, thoughts, ideas, biases, and so on, as they interact with the actual facts. The facts never just speak from the cells. They have to be interpreted through some lens, some theory. That comes up more than anything else. It comes up over and over again as the substrate, I think, of all of these other 4. Times arrow, time cycle, adaptationism, non-adaptationism, which Carol referenced with evolutionary psychology, and Don did with the panda's thumb. Not everything is well adapted. How do we tease those apart? punctuationism, gradualism. In the essays themselves, by the way, I should point out, punctuated equilibrium there's only one full essay dedicated to it out of the 300, his Opus 200, the 200th one he wrote. So, okay, fine. But critics say, oh, he's just using those essays to promote his own personal theories. Well, the theory he's most well known for is almost never even mentioned. And then contingency, necessity. My favorite, but it doesn't come up as often as I thought it would. Now, these are not independent themata. The concept of the themata, these sort of bipolar pairs with shades of gray in between, but the spectrum are not independent of one another. I mean, contingency could certainly be part of times arrow. They're certainly overlapping. I teased them apart because I wanted 5. I don't know. It just seemed like a nice round number. But also because you used contingency in many different ways in a lot of the essays than you did times arrow. When it was a specific story being told, this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And in a particular way to drive home a point, I separated that from times arrow, which you discussed in slightly different contexts. Then I took, because I want to do an article about Gould as a historian of science for our flagship journal called ISIS of the History of Science Society is our big society on this. And their former editor and chief bottle washer, Ron Numbers, who wrote the best book ever written on the creationists, told me that he thought, in his opinion, the 2 most important historians of science of the 20th century were Thomas Kuhn and Steve Gould. And that really got my attention, because I never really thought of Steve as a historian of science, and then I started thinking about it. Yeah, he is a historian of science, and you count them all up. So here I just broke down what historians of science do, what he did, the relationship of culture and science, the history of evolutionary theory. See, even here, more on the relationship of culture and science than evolutionary theory. That's that theory-data themata. Philosophy of science, not technical philosophy of science like professional philosophers of science do, but more, and that hardly ever comes up, more as a tertiary level. Usually in the last paragraph of the essay comes in the little punch, like it's the payoff for the reader. This is what you've been waiting for. You've been plugging along through here. You've got all these interesting details. Boom. It's what all that tells us about how science is done, which is the most interesting part of this, I think. So we played around with this a little bit. That's that themata of and here Pat Lindsay's brilliant cover shows this idea of gradualism, punctuated equilibrium, the expanding triangle of diversification, whereas in Gould's model, diversification is much wider, and then there's a winnowing down. These are hotly debated subjects, but again, it's that themata we were trying to capture. There's something deeper going on in the details. Now, one of Gould's favorite quotes gives us some insight as to what's really going on here. About 30 years ago, this is from Charles Darwin in a letter he wrote September 18th, 1861. About 30 years ago, there was much talk that geologists ought only to observe and not theorize. I well remember someone saying that at this rate, a man might as well go into a gravel pit and count the pebbles and describe the colors. How odd it is that anyone should not see that all observation must be for or against some view if it is to be of any service. So I've now changed my mind. I think Steve is not a historian of science. He's a scientific historian. It's a difference. That is, because I was thinking about this, what bores me about reading history books and all these great articles in ISIS and so on is that they tell a narrative story, which is good and important and interesting. This happened, and 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 it's good to know those details. But what Steve does, and what Jared Diamond does, what Frank Sulloway does, is they say, now, this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Now let's stop and ask ourselves, why did it happen this way? Why did this guy do that? Why did this trend? Jared does this in Guns, Germs, and Steel. He says, why did these big trends happen? Frank does this in Revolutions. Steve does this throughout his essays. In other words, he's using history to make a point about something else, something deeper, about human nature, about how science works, about evolutionary theory. And I don't think that's Whiggish. I don't think that's wrong. In fact, I think that's honest. That's what historians should be doing, and they should do it up front, because all observation must be for or against some view, or what's the point? And if they don't do it overtly, then their own subconscious biases are just going to drive it anyway. So why not just put it out on the line? And that, to me, is what makes history interesting, because, after all, those people are all dead. History is for us, right? For us to get something deeper out of what we know about the past. So then we can go a deeper level. What is the nature of genius, and why some people are good at writing brilliant essays like this and others aren't? Steve himself asked this question at the end of an essay in February 1996. What is the nature of genius? Why do some brilliant people make revolutions and others die in the dust of concepts whose time had begun to pass in their own day? What is the crucial difference between Darwin's transcendent greatness and James Dwight Dana's merely ordinary greatness? I do not know the answer to this question of questions, but we can surely specify a key ingredient. Somehow, for some reason of psyche or quirk of mind, some impetus of social life, or some drive of temperament, Darwin was driven to challenge, to be fearless in bringing down an entire intellectual universe, to be joyful in trying out each thrilling and lovely bit of furniture in a reconstructed world. Dana, for other properties of the same attributes, could not, or dared not, abandon the traditional hope and succor of centuries, rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Nicely used phrase there, brilliantly written. But the question is there, what is the nature of genius? So I tried to get at this when I was studying Carl. There's a book, yeah, I have more data. There's a book called The SETI Pioneers, in which the author collected all the people that founded and pioneered SETI, including Carl, and interviewed them. Now, he didn't do much. This is a lot of great data, but he really didn't do much of it. He noticed and had a chart in the appendix, of all places, at the back, that there was an interesting birth order sequence. These guys were all firstborns or firstborn males. And he said, isn't that interesting? What of it? Well, of course, by the time I got this book, I knew Frank Sulloway, so I thought, oh my God, Frank will love this stuff because he does all this birth order. So we took a look at it, and now the author of this book never asked the question, is this a statistically significant difference between the general population of how many firstborns you would expect versus this particular population, which is not a very big population? Well, it turns out there's a test you could run. Frank, of course, has the test. We ran the test. It is statistically significant difference. This is an unusual number of firstborns. Now, and consistently, all of them are non-believers or agnostics, or a couple are atheists. All of them feel that the SETI program is a worthwhile project. None of them believe in UFOs. Now, in the essay I wrote on Carl, on these books and in which all this appears in Skeptic, I played around with the idea of SETI as a sort of quasi-secular, not religion, but some sort of a feeling of transcendence that Carl captured so well in his writings and in Cosmos, that there's something bigger than us that is the cosmos. But there's almost a feeling in Carl's writings that this is something, he doesn't believe in God, there's something else going on. And at the end of Contact, of course, that's what his character discovers, the hidden nature of pi in the universe. All right, but I don't want to play around with that too much because I don't know where to go with it and how to test that anyway. I think what's interesting is this here, that what makes some people open to what at the time was a radical concept of searching for extraterrestrial intelligence, but not open to UFO beliefs. What's the difference between these two? So Frank and I asked that question about Carl, and we actually did a personality profile of Sagan. What we did was we took this battery of questions. It's called the Big Five Personality Inventory. It's a series of adjective pairs. Open-minded, closed-minded, shy, outgoing, these kinds of things. And there's 40 of them. Now, you personally could take it and look and see how you score compared to the rest of the population, and you get a percentile score of where you are on, let's say, openness to experience compared to the other 100,000 people that have taken the test that are in Frank's database at UC Berkeley. So how do you do this with a dead person? Well, Randy can discuss this later about channeling, and I'm sure James Van Praagh could get the answers to the questions we need after he's done talking to Sonny for share on important matters like that. What you do is you get people that know the person. Now, if they're long gone, Darwin or Wallace, you get biographers who know the person pretty well. Now, look, this isn't hard science, right? But it's an attempt to quantify and get an answer to a question. So this is what we found with Carl, exceptionally high conscientiousness, which is what you'd expect from, in Frank's model, and he'll go into this in more depth, from a firstborn. Firstborns are more parent-identified. They are better at academic-type tasks. They're high in conscientiousness. What you don't expect from that set of parameters is the openness to experience. Now, I'm going to let Frank deal with some of those, the deeper issues, what might be behind that. What I want to play with here in my limited time is this, the difference between these two here, I think, is interesting. What we're getting at here is what Thomas Kuhn called the essential tension in science. The essential tension between being open-minded enough to accept radical new ideas, but not so open that your brains fall out. You got to find the balance between, say, the SETI program and the ufologists and the alien abductees. What's the difference between those two? And why are some more open than others? And agreeableness is an interesting one. One of the characteristics that gives you a score of high or low on agreeableness is tender-minded, tough-minded. Excuse me. Carl was a reasonably tough-minded individual, and actually, that's good. When you're in our business, the rough and tumble world of ideas where there's a lot of bad ideas, and there are a lot of bad ideas in our business, there's a lot of bunk that needs debunking. And you can't be too conciliatory. If you're too kind, too willing to suffer fools, as it were, too eager to please, it's harder to be critical. And in our business, it's actually good to have this particular set of parameters here. High conscientiousness, high openness to experience, and a little tough-mindedness there. All right, so that's what we did for Carl. So we got 8 of Steve's colleagues who know him very well to rank him. And it almost parallels Carl's in the sense of that high openness to experience. He's at the 99, as high as you can possibly get. He's matching Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace in that category. High conscientiousness, just the right amount of tough-mindedness to deal with all the cranky bad ideas. By comparison, Wallace, too agreeable. He's too nice. He's too open. Wallace, brilliant scientist, co-discoverer of natural selection, believer in spiritualism, phrenology, and all kinds of wacky ideas, went to seances, whereas Darwin would never do this. Now, so when we're asking the question, why would Darwin be skeptical of the spiritualism movement and Wallace be open to it? We're asking a question that has to do with personality and temperament and a particular style of intellectual reasoning. Darwin, by the way, just so you're curious, again, matching Gould on actually high consciousness, high openness to experience. So even though he has high agreeableness, we have to look at other characteristics in Darwin's past as to why he was skeptical rather than not. So what I'm looking at there, again, then, is Steve as striking that correct balance that I would guess, and I'm going to throw it out here, if we did the test on Randy, it would come out very similar to this. High open-mindedness, high conscientiousness, tough-mindedness. And then the next project I want to do is test all you guys, all the skeptics, to see where skeptics fall in this. Again, we can't make too much of it, but it's a start to quantifying, to try to get at that deeper question, the deep answer to the deeper question. All right, I'm going to finish up with just, and Frank will pick it up there and talk about biography. I want to finish up by talking about one particular essay where all these themes come into play. One of my favorite, it wasn't actually a favorite ahead of time. I just grabbed one out of the pile to see if my themata scheme actually worked. I just grabbed one and said, okay, let's see if these themes come out. So this is an essay called Modified Grandeur, March of 1993. So he begins with a Gilbert and Sullivan, which is a wonderful story. In an old theatrical story, W.S. Gilbert was leading a rehearsal for the premiere of his most famous collaboration with A.S. Sullivan, The Mikado. At one point, Nanki-Poo learns that his beloved Yum Yum is about to marry her guardian, Coco. Searching for a straw of light, he asks, But you do not love him? Alas, no, she replies. On hearing this sliver of mitigation, Nanki-Poo exclaims, Rapture, or so Gilbert originally wrote. But at the rehearsal, Nanki-Poo stated his line too forcefully, giving the limited comfort provided by Yum Yum, and Gilbert shouted down from the balcony, Modified rapture. The poor tenor, not grasping that Gilbert had only meant to correct his tone, and thinking that he had flubbed his line, exclaimed, "Modified rapture," at the reprise. This unintended correction elicited a good laugh, and so the line has remained ever since. If something so unvarnished as rapture must often be modified, let me pose a question in a similar vein. How should we modify grandeur? Now that's a nice use of a literary story from popular culture, but that gets to a point. Okay, so that's how the essay begins. You see the outline and the structure beginning. Then he turns to, I'm sorry, this slide came out a little blurry, discussing the quote that I've already put up on the slide that you've all seen. It's printed on everything we've sent you about grandeur. The question is, why didn't Darwin use the word evolution in The Origin of Species? It doesn't appear once. The word evolved appears right at the end. So Gould writes in this, continuing in the essay, I believe that Darwin shunned this word because he recognized that natural selection, his theory of evolutionary mechanisms, contained no postulate about progress as a necessary feature of organic history. And in vernacular English at the time, the word evolution meant progress, literally unfolding according to a preset plan. So we begin with a Gilbert and Sullivan, a little story. Then he discusses Darwin and his use or not use of the word for a deeper purpose. It's not just history of science for the fun of it. What did Darwin think just for fun? Because he wants to make a deeper point about evolutionary theory. And he continues, we feel that we have gained, well, okay, so the essay then picks up and discusses the idea of grandeur pre-Darwin, Darwin, post-Darwin. And that does the theory of evolution take the grandeur out of life if there is no creator? And he continues, we feel that we have gained greatly in factual and theoretical understanding through these three stages, but if we have lost a degree of grandeur for each step of knowledge gained, then we must fear Faust's bargain, for what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? So we get Gilbert and Sullivan and the Bible in one essay, plus a little Faust. Brilliantly used. Now, he then picks up the story. He gets invited, of all things, to give the keynote address at the Hand Surgeons Society. You know, there's societies for everything. And he's giving the opening keynote address, and he just happens to have on his bookshelf, or maybe he went out and bought it for this, but I think he just happened to have it, Charles Bell's The Hand, Its Mechanism, and Vital Endowments of Evincing Design. This is part of the Bridgewater Treatise. Basically, how shall we say, Charles Templeton of the time, right, funding research that would show design in nature. And the Bridgewater Treatise were the product of this, of which Charles Bell contributed. So instead of giving a canned speech that any professional speaker would just go give, Steve writes a whole speech about this evincing design argument from The Hand, where, Bell writes, there is extreme grandeur, modifying grandeur, in the thought of an anticipating or prospective intelligence and reflecting that what was finally accomplished in man was begun in times incalculably remote and antecedent to the great revolutions which the Earth's surface has undergone. So, that's pre-Darwin, and then of course, then Steve comments, what could be more grand, more extremely grand, he modifies grand, than such a purposeful drama that puts Homo sapiens both in perpetual center stage and atop the ultimate peak at the end of the last act. But of course, Darwin changes this. But Darwin has taken us down a peg, at least in terms of our standard cultural hopes and deep-seated arrogances. Bell's progressive creationism gave us a foreordained history of life, always perfect but moving upward toward an inevitable hypothesis of the origin of Homo sapiens. Darwin still sees expansion from original simplicity, the ever-ramifying tree of life in his metaphor, but specific outcomes are no longer ordained, and increase in complexity is only a broad trend, not a grand highway toward life's primary goal. Okay, again, we're seeing a discussion of Darwin, but not just for Darwin's sake, not just for historical sake, but to make a point about progress and time zero, time cycle. It's that deeper themata. Darwin, however, doesn't complete his own revolution because he's a truly eminent Victorian, a wealthy white male committed to and greatly benefiting from a society that had, perhaps more than any other in human history, made progress the centerpiece of its credo. How could Darwin jettison progress altogether in this age of industrial might, military triumph, and colonial expansion. Darwin therefore placed a modified form of progress back into his view of life through a supplementary argument about ecology and competition. Specifically, Darwin wrote, "The inhabitants of each successive period in the world's history have beaten their predecessors in the race for life and are, insofar, higher in the scale of nature, and this may account for that vague yet ill-defined sentiment felt by many paleontologists that organization on the whole has progressed." Okay, so he sneaks a little progress back into the theory. So then Gould takes us into the post-Darwinian. He's going to complete the Darwinian revolution here. And where are we today when many paleontologists espouse a view of life with even less emphasis on progress, if not an outright denial of the concept in any conventional sense? An increasing sensitivity to the many elements of randomness and contingency that make any particular pathway, including the route to Homo sapiens, utterly unpredictable and unlikely ever to arise again if the tape of life could be replayed from scratch. Bell exalted humans at the top rung of an inevitable ladder. Darwin perceived us as a branch on a tree, but still as a topmost shoot representing a predictable direction of growth. Many paleontologists, myself included, now view Homo sapiens as a teeny and unpredictable twig on a richly ramifying tree of life, a happy accident of the last geological moment, unlikely ever to appear again if we could regrow the tree from seed. And so then he draws the essay to a conclusion. For me, then, I will admit that grandeur must remain a largely personal and aesthetic concept. The modern view is grandest of all, for we have finally freed nature from a primary judgment for placement of one little twig upon its copious bush. We can now step off and back and see nature as something so vast, so strange, yet comprehensive, and so majestic in pursuing its own ways without human interference, that grandeur becomes the best word of all for expressing our interest and our respect. So in there, then we see all the light, minutiae stuff, Gilbert and Sullivan, the Bible, and so on. Then the history of science, then the evolutionary theory as the substrate underneath it all. In conclusion, and in fact, Gould, that's not the concluding paragraph. He concludes by discussing how should he modify grandeur. He says, well, maybe ineffable grandeur or unspeakable grandeur, but if it's unspeakable, then you can't speak it, so what good is that? Or terrific grandeur, as in dinosaurs are terrific, as in terrifying or awesome grandeur. Then he turns, of course, as only Steve would, to the Oxford English Dictionary, which says transcendent, this is grandeur, the usage of grandeur, transcendent greatness or nobility of intrinsic character. Steve was kind enough to write the foreword for my book, Why People Believe Weird Things, and in there, he looked up the use of the word. He talked about the meaning of the word skeptical. I can't believe that in the first 7 years of running Skeptic magazine, the Skeptic Society, I never looked it up. I mean, it's embarrassing. I never looked it up. It means thoughtful. Not cynic or anything like this. Thoughtful, inquiring. And in later modified versions, the Oxford English Dictionary gives these different levels of its usage over time. It has also meant a mark to aim at. So I would propose that we modify grandeur as skeptical grandeur and pay tribute to our hero as a man who transcends greatness and nobility of intrinsic character, Stephen Jay Gould. Steve, we got another letter here from Lynn Margulis, which she sent in a few days ago on the occasion of your Festschrift. Dear Steve, Carlene Schwartz and I still marvel at our good fortune generated by Robert H. Whittaker and his wife's untimely death by environmentally induced P32 bone cancer. When you rescued the foreword to Five Kingdoms in your unprecedented prose style, the book took on a swell of new life that was accessibly Gouldian. Who but you could monthly generate elegant, rich, and fulsome prose that brought joie de vivre to the people? She read this over the telephone. Get it down. and sense and evidence to the skeptic. You are for natural history an impossible act to follow. See, what would be the analogy? DiMaggio to Mantle? So they got to find something like this. When in Amherst College recently, you detailed that, quote, Darwinian evolution is a fact as solid as any other in science, close quote, and the freshman ignoramuses on a straight-line course to corporate executiveness balked, I decided you need to be either canonized in some Jewish equivalent or cloned. Perhaps some donors at the Skeptic Society will begin to solicit financial support for at least one of my suggestions. Keep up the good fight for enlightenment. Much love forever, Lynn Margulis. Our next speaker I met in 1991 when I was working on my doctoral dissertation on Alfred Russel Wallace in the history of science, and I came across a short story in the Los Angeles Times about a scientific conference at which some MIT social scientist had identified birth order as a relevant factor in the development of the acceptance or rejection of revolutionary new ideas. So I read on, and it talked about the birth order of Charles Darwin being a later born, so I quickly went to my notes, and sure enough, Wallace is a later born. I thought, boy, I should call this guy up. So I did. I just called him out of the blue at MIT and identified myself, and he was kind enough to talk to me. And he is a kind, talkative, agreeable, highly open to experience, a little lower in conscientiousness perhaps than Steve. This is Frank Sulloway, the man who has pioneered this research in what we might call biometrics or some sort of applying methods of science to the study of history, the study of biography. After all, these are humans that did these things, and we hopefully have learned something about human behavior in the last century, or maybe not as much as we'd like to think we have, but we've learned something. Frank's also done a number of important areas of research related to Darwin. He wrote a book on Freud, the biologist of the mind, in which he identified Freud's connection to Darwin in his use of the biogenetic law. In fact, he sort of talked about Freud as a biologist of the mind was the subtitle. It was also Frank who identified the fact that Darwin did not become an evolutionist on the Beagle. At the Galapagos. That in fact, it wasn't until he got home, we identified the different finches. In fact, he didn't even have enough in the collection. And Frank actually went to the archives and went to the Natural History Museum and got the specimens themselves. And he's the guy that figured all that out. And it's a great story. Anyway, all that culminated in his book, Born to Rebel, in 1996, which became a bestseller in which he applied these ideas. And so Frank's going to pick up where I left off and talk about these deeper issues and some of the work of Steve in biography and the application of science to biography. So with that, please help me welcome Dr. Frank Sulloway.
Well, it's a very daunting thing to be here honoring Stephen Jay Gould and watching that list of doctorates and honorary doctorates and all those publications. And you know, the worst thing about it is that Steve has written 3 more articles since we've all been sitting here this morning. I'm going to talk this afternoon about a problem that's sort of dear to heart to all of us historians of science who have racked our brains over the enigmas of creativity and genius, and I call this talk Prospects for a Biographical Science with vignettes from the life of Charles Darwin. Among the many fascinating questions that Steve has considered over the years in his many, many essays are those relating to Darwin's own achievements. Because of their extraordinary level and extraordinary breadth, it really is a terribly enigmatic question as to why Darwin did what he did. Darwin himself was very puzzled about his achievements. He makes the following rather wonderful comments about it in his autobiography. My success as a man of science, whatever this may have amounted to, has been determined, as far as I can judge, by complex and diversified mental qualities and conditions. Of these, the most important have been the love of science, unbounded patience in long reflecting over any subject, industry in observing and collecting facts, and a fair share of invention as well as common sense. with such moderate abilities as I possess, it is truly surprising that I should be influenced to a considerable extent the beliefs of scientific men on some important points. If you go back over that wonderful statement, it's 3 sentences and it has about 8 qualifiers. Darwin truly was a modest man. Darwin himself was very interested in the problem of scientific creativity. He actually told a geologist named Judd in the latter years of his life that he was thinking of doing a study on scientific creativity. In 1871, the year he published A Descent of Man, and about the time this photograph was taken of him, he wrote a letter to his son Horace, which had a wonderful statement in it. I've been speculating last night what makes a man a discoverer of undiscovered things, and a most perplexing problem it is. Many men who are very clever, much cleverer than the discoverers, never originated anything. And how true that is. As a tribute to Darwin's own self-effacing ways, his own favorite explanation for genius was the phrase, "It's dogged is as does it." He thought it was just hard work. Well, surely doggedness was not responsible for all of Darwin's achievements, and of course many of his most ardent opponents were just as dogged as he was. So we're really left right back where we were with the puzzle that we have. Darwin's revolutionary genius is even more surprising when you consider his status in British society. I ask you, is this the face of a revolutionary? Maybe this guy, but not this guy. This paradox is even more heightened when we consider his social class and the analysis that's been done on it by various Darwin scholars, particularly Adrian Desmond and James Moore. They wrote a whole biography of Darwin, The Life of a Tormented Evolutionist, from the perspective, kind of a Marxist perspective, of a man who had betrayed his class interests with such a radical theory as evolution. As Steve has commented about this book in a review he wrote of it in Nature magazine, but what made Darwin tick? Why him? For all Desmond and Moore have helped me to understand, their social approach leaves me with an immensely heightened sense of paradox. For I now grasp why Darwin was absolutely the wrong person for the job. He was exactly what Huxley yearned to sweep out, an amateur upper-class naturalist of inherited wealth, an Oxbridge product who had collected beetles and hoped for a parsonage. Well, we're back again where we started. These are the kinds of great global questions, scientific genius, scientific creativity, that the psychobiographers have longed to solve, and in particular people like Freud and Erik Erikson have written many psychobiographies in which they tried to unlock the secret of genius in their victims. Such prominent efforts by psychohistorians really show us what an immense lure science has had for some of us in trying to understand what makes people tick. And of course, this is really the age-old tension between the problems of time's arrow and time's cycle, a topic to which Steve has devoted a lot of his career, not just a book, but many of the themes in his columns in natural history. And we see in the tension between time's arrow and time's cycle two very different phenomenon. On the one hand, we have with time's arrow the kind of non-cyclical changes, directionality, contingency. With time's cycle, we have the repeatable phenomenon, the seasons and so forth, and of course, predictability. And in science, these stand for the metaphors of narrative history and contingency and non-repeatable events, and of course, the physical sciences and reductionism. What the psychobiographers, of course, were trying to do was find some key here and apply it to here and reduce all this to some sensible whole. Unfortunately, it doesn't work quite that simply. Well, how do we juggle this tension between time's arrow and time's cycle in biography? Is there the possibility for a scientific form of biography? I'd like to suggest that the answer to that is yes, in a modest way. I think we will eventually be able to achieve the goals of a scientific history, and I think we've already made some progress in doing that already. I would also like to suggest that such histories are going to end up being very Darwinian in their nature. Not very Freudian, but very Darwinian. And finally, I'm going to try to persuade you today that some of these Darwinian features are already in place, and it can explain certain aspects of human behavior. Well, let's take biography itself. It's actually a lot like evolution. And thanks to Darwin and many others since him, evolution is accepted as a scientific pursuit. Now, the reasons for this are, of course, the many parallels that we see between evolution in a broad sense and biography in a more narrow sense. I like to consider sort of evolution Darwinian macrohistory. After all, Darwin wrote the greatest history ever written by mankind, and that is the history of life on Earth, the origin of species. And microhistory has very similar problems. Most basic to all historical inquiries are issues about how the past explains the present. This explains in biology things like why certain organisms have certain features like gill arches in the embryos of mammals. But in Darwinian microhistory, we have very similar problems. Why family legacies, for example, have the impact that they have. We also have in evolution issues about adaptation to local environments. In biology, that explains lots of exquisite adaptations that biologists worry about. But we have psychological adaptations in individual lives via learning, and many of those are relevant to what a biographer tries to understand. For example, why Darwin had the personality that he had. And of course, both fields have the paradox of how you deal with chance events. In evolution, we have genetic mutations, recombination, contingent events of all sorts, and that happens in biography all the time. For example, why Darwin got the invitation to sail on the Beagle voyage. Now, these many, many parallels probably explain one of the least appreciated features about Darwin, and that is he was very unusual in his interest in biography. He wrote an autobiography, as I'm sure most of you know. He also wrote one of the first baby biographies of his eldest son, William, born in 1841 and was finally published in the 1870s. He wrote a great deal of his autobiography about his father, Robert Waring Darwin, seen here in this picture. And finally, he wrote a biography of his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. And if we want to be generous in our use of the word biography, he wrote a biography of the human species. This was the greatest biographer who have ever lived, really, in many of his great achievements. So, what would scientific biography be like if we tried to scale it down to the level of microhistory? Well, one thing we know is they won't be at all like Freudian psychobiographies, and there's a very simple reason for that. That is Freud's heavy reliance on non-Darwinian principles, and in particular, on the biogenetic law. Steve has written at great length about the enormous impact that the biogenetic law had in the late 19th century and even into the early 20th century in fields like psychology and education and many other areas, anthropology. And one of its greatest victims, I guess we would have to say, was Sigmund Freud. He believed, following Haeckel, that individuals retraced or recapitulated the phylogenetic history of their race, and therefore that you could use phylogeny to unlock ontogeny. And that had very specific implications for Freud's own thinking as a psychoanalyst. For example, why in Freudian theory are there oral and anal stages in sexual development? Why isn't there a nasal stage, or who knows what? Well, the answer is quite simple. This is Ernst Haeckel's illustration of his gastrea theory, the theory of the original sort of multicellular organism that invaginates to form a stomach, and that becomes the mouth. And the first form of reproduction was sort of a cannibalistic stage, as in psychoanalysis. And that is literally the reason why in Freudian theory the oral stage is the first stage in sexuality. It is the recapitulation of the original phylogenetic form of sexuality. With the evolution of a gastrointestinal tract and finally an anal region, you have the possibility of elevation of the sexual instinct, or some might say demotion of the sexual instinct. And finally, the evolution of genitalia results in the genital stages. So Freud, of course, never published a great deal of this, but he planned to. In the 1916-17, when this photograph was taken, he collaborated with Sander Ferenczi on the left in this photograph. And only about a decade ago, the manuscript that they were planning to write came to light, or part of that manuscript, or the ideas associated with it. And they were very similar to some of the ideas that Ferenczi himself had published in an earlier book. And they're very much dependent on the biogenetic law. Here we see, for example, that the development of marine life in phylogeny is paralleled by the embryo in the uterus, the watery uterus. You can get it. You know what the point is there. And here we have the development of the genital zones, which is a recapitulation of the phylogeny of that. And finally, if you ever wondered why your children aren't so sexual after age 3, as in Freudian theory at least, it's because they're shivering through the ice ages. You know, I'm surprised no psychoanalyst ever tested this. If it literally was recapitulation, you should have a temperature drop in all children from ages 3 to 13 or 14. But of course, testing was not a big feature of psychoanalytic theory. Well, Freud applied these ideas to a considerable extent in his biographical work and his case histories. We see it, for example, in the case history of the Wolfman. The Wolfman was named after a strange dream that he had, which you see in the next slide. The dream was of 5 or 6 wolves sitting in a tree. They were white wolves. You'll all immediately see the deeper psychoanalytic meaning of this dream. And Freud, in fact, interpreted the dream as meaning that he had seen as a child the white underwear of his parents. And that, of course, meant he'd seen them having coitus. Well, the Wolfman said, no, I don't remember that. I never had that memory. And Freud kept saying, you'll remember, you know. And the Wolfman kept saying, no, I don't remember. And so Freud dealt with this very cleverly in his works by saying, of course, in the Wolfman case history, a child catches hold of his phylogenetic experience where his own experience fails him. Well, that was the case with the Wolfman. We see actually many of these statements throughout Freud's writings. And of course, what they represent is an attempt to take the sort of predictability of phylogeny and literally make a direct translation into ontogeny. And of course, that theory failed with the demise of the biogenetic law. Well, what then would we need to achieve a scientific biography if we gut it of its erroneous Freudian notions and try to put something in its place, particularly using a Darwinian perspective rather than a Haeckel'ian or biogenetic or Lamarckian perspective? Well, there are 3 basic principles to scientific history that I think we could perhaps agree on. The first and most important, which was lacking in psychoanalysis, is testability. And this brings up the problem I like to call of intellectual couch potatoes. And I actually have in mind here Sigmund Freud's couch. I sat on that couch, by the way, when I worked on Freud. I was very careful to get up very quickly. But by this problem, I really mean the problem that you cannot test psychoanalytic ideas on the couch because the patient is contaminated with the theory and the therapist knows the theory and so on. And so all that work that psychoanalysts put in over the years in what they thought was testing has turned out to be worthless because it's really a sort of a collusion process. But the metaphor applies equally well to other areas of history. People sit on the couch. They don't test their claims, and we need to get beyond that. I have made a specific test of a number of ideas, and as an example here, I'm giving you the test I made of Adrian Desmond's hypothesis about politics and its association with social class in the Darwinian Revolution. One of Desmond's claims was that lower class individuals were much more open to evolution than upper class individuals. So I took a sample of about 600 scientists who spoke out on evolution, classified them in terms of not only their own social class, but the social class of the family they came from, and the correlation is almost exactly 0. If you look, however, at Adrian Desmond's own sample in his book, The Politics of Evolution, he has an appendix that lists about 80 individuals who were the key players in his story. You have a wonderful correlation. All of the lower class individuals are quite radical. But it is a self-selection of all the lower class radicals, leaving out all the lower class conservatives, and a self-selection of all the upper class conservatives, leaving out all of the upper class radicals, and hence you have a very nice correlation. So really, Darwin is no paradox at all based on that thesis. And it points out really a problem we see over and over again. If you do not test your claims, you always end up seeing what you're looking for. It doesn't matter whether you're Freudian or Marxist or whatever theory you hold, you always see evidence that backs up that theory. So we need to test our claims, and that's probably the most important lesson of all, because no matter what theory you start out with, if you test your claims and your theory's no good, you get rid of it sooner or later. The other feature of a scientific history that I think is worth emphasizing is the pluralistic nature of the explanations that we're going to see in all attempts at scientific history. And really, evolution is a metaphor for that. A proper theory of evolution is never a single-factor theory. It has many, many different mechanisms, many multiple influences. And in biography and history, what we see is many little things contribute just a little bit here and there, but you can test them. Finally, the most important aspect of a scientific approach to any form of history has to emphasize the interactionist nature of these processes. Nothing is predetermined in any simple way. Even in human life, biology plays a role, but that role is always extremely complicated because it is an interaction of expressions of biological dispositions with life experience, and the whole interest of the story is usually in those interactionist processes. So let me give some examples from Darwin's own life, starting with the question of why Darwin sailed on the Beagle voyage. And before I answer that question, let's ask the question, did it make any difference if Darwin sailed on the Beagle voyage? Well, we can test that. Normally, we associate Darwin's going on the Beagle with his becoming an evolutionist. And we can ask the question, for example, was somebody who traveled to different continents, different areas of the world, who saw more of the world than you would see sitting on the couch back in England, more likely to accept a theory like evolution? And I've taken... here's the route of the Beagle. As you know, he circumnavigated the globe over a 5-year period. There's the Beagle pulling into the Galapagos Islands in 1835. And here is data that I collected on about 400 individuals who spoke out on evolution. I simply coded how far they traveled from their place of birth and how much they accepted evolutionary theory. Darwin and Wallace, of course, circumnavigated the globe, so they get the highest score on this measure. And you can see there's about a 2-to-1 difference between those people who had extensive travel and their acceptance of evolution and those people who didn't. That's pretty good. You get a doubling of the acceptance rate. It's not a phenomenal difference, but it's certainly a significant difference. Well, let's look back at some of the questions related to Darwin's own going on the Beagle voyage. Well, chance events obviously played a large role. And it's funny about great achievements in life. We tend to emphasize the role of chance almost out of proportion to its meaning. And in the history of science, chance looms very large in many of the myths that we have. You know, the apple falling on Newton's head or Newton seeing the apple. I was watching one of the Star Treks recently. It turns out that Q was right there when it happened and actually caused the apple to fall on Newton's head. So it wasn't as much of a chance event as we like to think. But Darwin played this up very much in his autobiography, referring back to the shape of his nose, for example, the wonderful story in the autobiography, but I give just the short version here. The voyage of the Beagle has been by far the most important event in my life and has determined my whole career. Yet it depended on so small a circumstance as my uncle offering to drive me 30 miles to Shrewsbury, which few uncles would have done, and on such a trifle as the shape of my nose. And of course, that's a reference to Fitzroy's belief in Lavateur's facial physiology and also to phrenology and so forth. Oh, there's no doubt that chance events did play a role in the Beagle voyage. But what we tend to underestimate is how much Darwin's own dispositions to travel played into the possibility of those chance events favoring him. For example, Darwin had already planned a voyage to the Canary Islands and was trying to recruit the very man who nominated him for the Beagle voyage, John Stevens Henslow, to go on that trip. So, of course, when Henslow got the offer and turned it down, who did he think of but this eager young undergraduate trying to get him to sail to the Canary Islands? Well, so we see there are many, many chance events that I haven't talked about. Obviously, to get onto the Beagle, you had to be the appropriate social class, given Fitzroy's requirements for a companion, the appropriate age, you had to be unmarried, or at least if you were married, you had to be prepared to get divorced. University educated, family wealth, and so on. And as we know, both Henslow and Leonard Jennings, his son-in-law, were offered the position before Darwin did, and so they had to turn it down. Well, we can also look at other evolutionary explanations, like the past explains the present. Well, the analog in Darwin's life is the traditions of his family, but particularly the natural history traditions that were actually mentioned by Henslow in his letter to others. But also we have complications here. Fitzroy was a Tory, and Darwin was a Whig, and so his family's liberalism almost worked against him. And finally, we have the issue of adaptations to local environments. And here I think Darwin's personality and its sources in his family experience played a big role. And in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit about Darwin's extraordinary openness to experience and also his very high levels of agreeableness. Darwin really was an open to experience kind of guy. I have a measure I made of participants in the Darwinian Revolution and other revolutions, and here you see openness operationalized as liberal social attitudes, broad scientific interests, and support for radical theories. Darwin and Wallace are way, way up on this measure. And we also see that people who were very, very open to experience were more likely to travel to far places. So the point here is that a lot of people got offered the Beagle Voyage. Some of them turned it down. The people who were less likely to turn that offer down were those who were very high in openness to experience. So that was a necessary but not a sufficient condition for being on the Beagle Voyage. One of the other important considerations about becoming a crew member on the Beagle was being able to get along with this man, Captain Robert Fitzroy. He was an aristocrat, a very temperamental man, as Darwin describes in his autobiography, very difficult to get along with. And Darwin really fit the bill in this regard. It was once said about Darwin that in the 5 years of the Beagle Voyage, he was the only person on that ship about whom no one ever said a bad word. And the person who made this statement then added, and if you knew what it was like to be cooped up on this little ship for 5 years, you'd really be impressed by that. Well, I've recruited, we can have, of course, Darwin rated by experts on traits like agreeableness, and Mike and I have made a beginning at that. But I've called in some special experts. Someone who knew him way back then, so there's a little more authenticity to the rating on this guy. So we have another rater, Mike, in our assessment. Well, let's take a look at some of the sources of variation in personality. That's really the question we need to understand how Darwin got so high on some of these particular traits. And we know from behavioral genetics, or at least they tell us, that the sources of variation can be divided into 4 major categories. Genetics, which explains anywhere from about 30 to 50% of the variance in most traits. Shared family experiences, which seem to contribute a very small amount to personality. And this is rather important, except for family values. The correlations between parent-offspring similarities in attitudes are very, very high, and that usually gets left out in the story. And finally, the role of the non-shared environment, which turns out to be the bulk of the variance that we can explain using environmental predictors. And then there's some error variance here. Now, the point I want to make here is this story is much too simplistic. Nothing in this category ever expresses itself directly. And this category is really the most interesting category because it has all the nuances and all the features of contingency and other features of law-like processes that we can talk about as biographers. And that's why I like to talk about some of these forces or patterns that are operative in the non-shared environment is really a kind of a Darwinian environmentalism. We normally think that Darwinian explanations all have to be genetic. And they don't. In fact, Darwinism is a theory that has a major role for open genetic programs, learning and ontogeny, and so forth. And that's the approach we need to take to begin to unravel some of the predictable aspects of human development. So let's take a look at some of the things that are important in that Darwinian drama. This is a wonderful Gary Larson cartoon. No, really, Mom, who do you like best? One of the things we know about siblings is they compete for parental investment. They have a lot of rivalry with one another. That story, which is a story common to many, many other biological organisms, is actually a rather uninteresting story because it is only part of the story that you really want to know about any particular person. And the rest of that story is a story of happen chance and contingency and how that drama works itself out in particular individual lives. So let's take a look at some of the things we can say about that story. This is a sort of Darwinian model of sibling differences in personality and social behavior. One of the extraordinary things we know from research in psychology in the last couple of decades is siblings who grow up in the same family are almost as different from one another as people plucked randomly from the general population. There are things in the family that are causing siblings to become different from one another. And those things involve all of the environmental contingencies that are synonymous with the influences of that non-shared environment. So one thing we know is that parental investment and parent-offspring conflict are major molders of personality. In particular, people who are younger siblings tend on average to score higher in openness to experience, but in a very peculiar way, in a sense of being untraditional or unconventional. Firstborns score just as high or even higher in openness to experience in a more purely intellectual sense. And finally, we know that conflict with a parent is something that makes people more open. If you distrust parental authority, you're more likely to distrust authority in general. Well, a lot has been said about Darwin's relationship to his father, and we can test that principle more generally with all the people in his cohort or generation. I had about 400 or 500 of these people rated in terms of how well they got along with their parents. And we can see in the next slide that high levels of parent-offspring conflict are indeed associated with much higher levels of support for evolutionary theory. Now, the problem with applying this to Darwin is his relationship with his father, although perhaps a little troubled at times, was in the sort of average zone. So we can't really say much about that in Darwin's own case because he simply didn't have a high enough level of parent-offspring conflict to be a relevant predictor in terms of what we know about trends more generally. So let's try another tack. Let's look at the consequences of the death of Darwin's mother when he was 8 and the relationship that ensued with his elder sister, Carolyn. Again, it's a testable proposition of what happens when an older sibling takes over the surrogate parent role and begins to boss you around. In fact, we can have well, here's a wonderful statement that Darwin made in his autobiography about that relationship. Before going to school, I was educated by my sister Carolyn. But I doubt whether this plan answered. Carolyn was extremely kind, clever, and zealous, but she was too zealous in trying to improve me. For I clearly remember, after this long interval of years, saying to myself when about to enter a room where she was, "What will she blame me for now?" Any of you remember that comment from your siblings? And I made myself dogged so as not to care what she might say. Notice that word dogged. That was the same word he used. It was his favorite expression for genius, that doggedness, that ability to sort of turn off your caring machinery, saying, I'm not going to listen to what that person says. I'm going to just go on about my own business. Well, I've had, here's a more schematic model of what I'm positing going on here. Firstborns typically, but any elder sibling who falls into the surrogate parent role, and Darwin's elder sister was herself a younger sister, engages in surrogate parental behavior and bossy behavior, and that leads to a whole series of predictable changes in personality, and we can document them. Surrogate parents are more conscientious. They are more assertive in the sense of being extroverted in the sense of assertiveness, and they score lower on agreeableness because they're more bossy and even tough-minded. So what can we say about that in Darwin's case? Well, these are data that I collected on over 2,000 scientists, actually. I only have birth order in about 1,500 of them. And you can see if you code people in terms of overall openness to experience as operationalized by liberal social attitudes, which Darwin certainly had, broad scientific interests in many, many multiple fields, extensive world travel, and finally, a willingness to support radical theories. The firstborns and the laterborns are significantly different on that measure. There's about a 3-to-1 greater probability of your being in the high group rather than the low group if you happen to be a younger sibling. It's not an enormous difference, but it is a statistical, reliable difference that we see over and over again in the history of science. What's interesting about Darwin and also about Wallace is that of the 2,500 scientists that I've had rated on this, or had scored on this particular measure, they were tied for third. That puts them in the top 1/3 of 1% of the measure on openness to experience. And if you're that high up, there's no way you can get over here unless you were, in fact, a younger sibling. There are lots of firstborns who were pretty open to experience, but to get all the way to the 99.7th percentile, you had to have everything working for you. So certainly, Darwin's birth order seems to have played a role. What about Darwin's agreeableness? This is a really interesting story. In the last year or so, I've collected data on the internet on more than 100,000 subjects. And the reason I've done this is because so much of human behavior is contingent. It's all dependent on things that happen in childhood and then things that happen in adulthood. Everything is a sort of a if-then scenario. All the interesting features about behavior are these wonderful some concatenations of environmental events with dispositions that date from early in life. So let's take a look at how agreeable are you in a workplace situation. Now remember, Darwin had to live with Fitzroy for 5 years on this ship, and he had to live in a subordinate status and hold his tongue and not get thrown out the window of the Beagle. And indeed, he was great at doing that. What we see here is that when people have higher social status in a workplace than somebody else, there's not much of a difference by birth order. In fact, when people have equal status, when we have status or don't have a lack of status, we're all pretty nice people. But you put people into a low status position, and all those firstborns are now trying to increase their status, and they do it with that little edge in their voice, that little dig, that little inclination, a little hint that they're really smarter than you are. These are all data I've collected by people who are in working relationships in businesses and so forth. The laterborns, when they get into a low status position, they're really easygoing. You know, they sort of think, I've been here before. And that's what Darwin, I think, did, and it's why I think he was such a good companion for Fitzroy on the Beagle voyage. Could a firstborn have made it into there? Yes, but would they have survived the Beagle voyage? I don't know about that. Well, we could tell a very similar story about how Darwin became an evolutionist and how other people became an evolutionist, and I'm going to do this very briefly here before I wrap up. In fact, it's a very Darwinian story. We start with the past explains the present, the role of the shared environment, and here the single best predictor of attitudes toward evolutionary theory were the social attitudes that you had in your own lifetime, and the single best predictor of your social attitudes are the social attitudes of the parents of the family you came from. So coming from a liberal family like Darwin did really made a big difference. In fact, if you're in the upper half of the social attitudes distribution as opposed to the lower half, that increased your likelihood of support for evolution by a factor of 10. That's a big, big predictor. Social class has no influence whatsoever. That's the big surprise. Individual adaptations to the non-shared environment. Of course, there are many, many of these. We've only just begun to understand these ontogenetic stories about how individuals adapt to family environments, and then in adulthood, how given certain dispositions, they manipulate their adaptations in complex ways, as I showed you with those workplace data. But we can say in the Darwinian Revolution, younger siblings were significantly more likely to be open to radical ideas. There's about a 7-to-1 difference odds ratio in the likelihood of Darwin accepting evolution because he was a younger sibling. Same, of course, applies to Wallace. Conflict with parents doesn't apply to Darwin really in this case, but if you had enough conflict, yes, it was a moderately good predictor. And finally, chance events. Well, world travel with all of the chance events that we've talked about in the Beagle voyage was a significant predictor. Now, what's interesting about all these predictors, most of them, not social attitudes, but conflict with parents, world travel, a lot of the predictors I've left off this chart, most of them just contribute a little bit to what happens to you. But you start adding them all up, and look, if you're in the top half of every one of those distributions, the chances are 21-to-1 greater that you became an evolutionist than if you didn't. And the one thing we know about Darwin is he was in the top half of every one of those distributions. His likelihood of becoming an evolutionist had everything going for it. There was not a single predictor I've ever looked at on which Darwin is in the wrong direction. And as a result, what we see when we plot the probability of an individual becoming an evolutionist based on a multivariate model is your opponents of evolution have very low probabilities based on all of these variables. The converts have moderately high probabilities based on these variables. And finally, the leaders of the Darwinian revolution are all above 95 percentile. Darwin, Wallace, and Patrick Matthew, for example, who anticipated the theory of natural selection in his 1831 book on naval timber. He may have been a smart guy to anticipate natural selection, but he wasn't so smart to publish it in a book on naval timber. Well, what's wrong with this story? What's wrong with this story is it's the beginning of a much more complex process that we really do not understand. And that more complex problem is one of countless interaction effects. I'm just going to give you a little flavor of how complicated it would really get in real life if we knew how to measure it. If you're high in openness to experience, which I think we can all say Darwin was from a relatively early age, and you develop voyaging inclinations, as Darwin did from about the age of 8, and you plan your trip to the Canaries and so forth, and that elicits or increases the probability of you getting an invitation to go on the voyage, and you go on the voyage, that in turn starts to affect everything else about you. So undoubtedly, the Beagle voyage pushed Darwin to re-examine his religious views, made him more socially liberal. That made it easier to be an evolutionist. It also caused him to broaden his scientific interests considerably, which increased his probability of being the genius that we know and so forth. Everything about Darwin begins to sort of escalate because of this set of feedback loops that get going. That's the thing we really don't know how to understand yet. We don't have adequate models for doing it. We know it's going on, but it's hard to pinpoint. Well, let me sum up here. What can we say about scientific history and scientific biography? Well, some aspects of biography really can be studied scientifically using formal methods. You can test a lot of things that you would think can't be tested. All you have to do is spend a lot of time off the couch doing it. And it's very tedious work sometimes, but it can be done. The answers to such questions tend, in general, not to be Freudian or Marxist. I'm not saying that social class interpretations of behavior are not important, but they're not important in a lot of ways we were told were important in the past. And if you want to know the difference, you have to go and test the idea. By contrast, the kinds of Darwinian adaptationist stories we can tell about ontogeny are very pluralistic. They involve lots of different potential factors, many of which we haven't tested yet. They're very environmentalist in the sense that they're all if-then strategies set in motion by circumstances in early life and later in adulthood. And so they're highly complex stories of interactions between some degree of genetic potential and lots of contingent events in the environment. And that's why, through all these countless interactions, biography, just like evolution, is really a complicated product of time's arrow and time's cycle. And for a better understanding of that, we have Steve to thank. Thank you.